Hey guys, tonight we are going to explore the astoundingly ancient and slow history of harvesting sea salt by hand. Picture it. A single, perfect, translucent crystal of sea salt sitting on a piece of dark bread and butter. You can almost feel the satisfying crunch, the bright flash of flavor that makes everything else taste more like itself. It's a mineral we take completely for granted. A simple white dust in a shaker on the table. But for nearly all of human history, this little crystal was white gold, the engine of empires, and the difference between survival and, well, an extremely bland demise. Frankly, stripped of your iodized table salt and sent back to an early agricultural village, your body would probably stage a full-scale rebellion within a few months. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I invite you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always warming to know how vast our community of nocturnal historians reaches. Our story begins long before recorded time, not with a king or a queen, but with one of our distant ancestors on a sun-drenched plain. Let's imagine a lone hominid making their way through the cradle of humanity in East Africa. The air is dry and hot, shimmering over the baked earth. This ancestor, part of a small hunter-gatherer band, lives a life dictated by immediate needs. Their diet is rich in the things they can hunt and kill. Fresh meat, organs, and blood provide their body with the essential salts it needs to function, to send signals from brain to muscle, to keep the heart beating in its steady, reliable rhythm. This early human does not know that they need salt in the abstract. They've never had it in its pure, crystalline form. The concept of seasoning does not exist. Food is simply fuel. Their world is one of intense observation. They watch the skies for circling vultures, a sure sign of a potential meal. They watch the tall grasses for the twitch of a rabbit's ear. And most importantly, they watch the larger animals. They follow the great herds of wildebeest and antelope, because where the herds go, life is sure to follow. One day, a strange sight catches their eye. The animals, instead of heading for the usual riverbank waterhole, are veering off course towards a peculiar, desolate-looking basin. It's a low depression in the earth, where water must have pooled in a long-forgotten rainy season, but is now just a cracked, white-glazed expanse under the blazing sun. The animals are not drinking. They are licking the ground. Elephants, giraffes, gazelles, all gathered in a rare, peaceable truce, patiently taking turns to scrape their powerful tongues over the crusty, white-caked mud. Curiosity, that most human of instincts, gets the better of our ancestor. They wait patiently for the great beasts to move on, their hand resting on the smooth wood of a simple spear. Cautiously, they approach the strange patch of earth. The ground crunches under their bare feet. Kneeling down, they mimic the animals they just witnessed. A single finger is pressed to the surface, gathering a fine white dust, and then brought to the lips. A shock ignites their tongue. It is a taste never experienced in such a concentrated, powerful way. It's sharp, intense, and profoundly interesting. It makes the mouth water. They scrape a little more of the flaky crust into the palm of one hand, and taste it again. This is different. This is something new. This isn't food in the traditional sense, but it makes them think of food. It conjures the memory of the roasted antelope from last night's fire, and how this sharp, bright taste would feel upon it. This was the discovery of a natural salt pan, or a salt lick. Historians still argue whether the initial human drive for salt was a conscious hunt to supplement a changing diet, or a series of happy accidents just like this one. As early humans began to spread, and agriculture slowly took hold thousands of years later, diets would shift heavily towards grains, which are desperately low in natural salt. That's when a gentle craving for this mineral would have become a biological imperative, a desperate, gnawing need. But for this primordial ancestor, it is a pure moment of wonder, a new sensation in a world still being mapped out by the senses. They have no way to carry it. No ceramic pot, no leather pouch that will not leak. All that can be carried is a small amount cupped in a dusty palm, a precious powder that seems as magical as a spark from a lightning strike. Trying to explain its value to their kin would be a magnificent challenge of grunts and enthusiastic gestures. To the world's first food critic, ready to deliver a rave review for magic dirt, but possessing no words to describe it. For now, our ancestor just knows that the world has somehow become a little more flavorful, and that they will remember to follow the animals to this special place again. The scene shifts, time spooling forward by millennia. The lone ancestor on the African savanna fades into the deep past, but their discovery, that potent, life-sustaining magic of salt, has taken root in the human story. We travel now to northern China, to the Loess Plateau of modern-day Shaanxi province. Here lies a lake, but not a lake of fresh, cool water. This is Lake Yunsheng, a vast inland salt lake that has been a center of human activity for so long that its story blurs the line between geology and mythology. It is, by many accounts, the oldest known industrial site on planet Earth, a place where the slow, patient work of harvesting salt began on a massive scale, perhaps 6,000 years ago. To the ancient Chinese, it wasn't just a lake, it was a gift from the gods, a self-replenishing bowl of treasure. Let's imagine the scene not as a modern tourist spot, but as it was in those early days. The lake itself is otherworldly, depending on the season and the mineral concentration. Its waters shift in a kaleidoscope of colors, from milky white to shocking pink and deep emerald green, a result of the unique algae and brine shrimp that thrive in the hypersaline environment. It looks less like a body of water and more like a painter's discarded palette. The air is thick with the smell of brine and sun-baked earth. Around its shores, generations of workers have toiled, their methods passed down through families, with a reverence usually reserved for sacred rites. Their movements are slow, deliberate, and in perfect harmony with the cycles of the sun and seasons. This is not a frantic mining operation. It is a form of geologic farming. The earliest technique, a system so perfect it was used for thousands of years, was a 5-step process of solar evaporation, elegantly simple and brutally laborious. Legend attributes its invention to the mythical Emperor Shun, but it was more likely the result of countless seasons of trial and error. The first step was to let nature do the initial work. The salty water from the main lake, called the North Pond, was channeled through a series of ditches and dikes into a vast chessboard of shallow man-made basins, the South Pond. Here the water would sit under the relentless summer sun. Day after day, the workers would watch and wait as the searing heat and dry winds did their slow work, pulling the moisture into the air, leaving behind an ever more concentrated brine. Then came the second stage, the crystallization. As the water vanished, a crust would begin to form on the surface of the clay pans. It started as a fragile, shimmering film, which thickened into a hard white shell. This was the moment of transformation, where liquid became solid, where the essence of the lake became a tangible, harvestable thing. Now the real labor began. Workers, their skin baked to a deep brown by the sun, would wade into the shallow, crunchy pans. They carried long wooden rakes, tools that had not changed in their essential design for 1,000 years. With practiced, rhythmic motions, they scraped the salt crust, breaking it up, and gathering it into small glittering mounds that looked like miniature snowdrifts under the hot Asian sun. It's the kind of back-breaking work that modern health and safety officers would have a field day with. No sunblock, no protective eyewear, just you, a wooden rake, and several square miles of glaringly bright, crystallized minerals. The fourth step was purification. The raked-up salt was coarse and mixed with mud and other impurities. It was carried in woven baskets to separate washing ponds, where it was rinsed with a less concentrated brine, a clever technique that washed away the dirt without dissolving too much of the precious product. Finally, the cleaned crystals were spread out on vast flat drying platforms, again to be baked by the sun one last time, ensuring every drop of moisture was gone. The result was a mound of sparkling, dry salt, ready to be weighed, taxed, and transported along the burgeoning trade routes of ancient China. The sheer importance of this one lake cannot be overstated. Control of Yunsheng meant wealth and power. Indeed, one of China's most foundational myths, the Battle of Zhulu, tells of the Yellow Emperor fighting the fierce tribal leader Qiu, a conflict that many historians believe was at its core a war for control of this very salt lake. One group had the salt, the other wanted it, and an epic, world-defining myth was born from the struggle. This place was more than just a source of seasoning, it was the treasury of nascent dynasties. The taxes levied on this salt helped to build armies, feed cities, and fund the construction of great walls. Archaeologists and historians continue to debate just how far back this industrial-scale production goes, with some evidence pushing the date ever closer to the Neolithic period, a time when humans were just beginning to settle into permanent villages. Standing by the shores of Yunsheng, one feels the immense weight of that labor, the millions of forgotten lives spent in the same rhythmic cycle of flooding, baking, raking, and drying. A gift from the gods, perhaps, but a gift that demanded a heavy price in human sweat. A fair trade, most would have argued, for the power to preserve food through long winters, and to make the gruel of daily life taste of something more than just survival. From the wind-scoured plains of China, our story drifts westward, carried on the currents of time and trade, to another ancient land defined by a great body of water. But here, the water is a source of life in a world of sand. Egypt. The Egyptians didn't just find their salt in sun-baked coastal pans, but in a strange, desolate valley northwest of the Nile Delta. This place, a natural depression in the desert, was known as Wadi el Natron, or the Natron Valley, and the substance they harvested from its dry lake beds was not pure sodium chloride. It was a unique, naturally occurring cocktail called natron, a mix of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and a bit of regular salt and sodium sulfate. This special mineral blend was more powerful than salt alone, and in the hands of the ancient Egyptians, it became the key to unlocking eternity. The sacred purpose of natron is its most famous. It was the essential ingredient in mummification, the complex ritual designed to preserve the body for its journey into the afterlife. In a special tent called the ebiu, or the place of purification, the body was washed. Then it was moved to the wabet, the pure place, where the embalmers began their solemn, meticulous work. These were not ghouls, but highly trained artisans and priests, their hands stained with cedar oil, and their minds filled with sacred incantations. After the internal organs were removed through a small incision in the abdomen, a delicate process in itself, the true work of preservation began. The body cavity was washed out with palm wine, and rinsed with spices, but the crucial step was the natron. Heaps of dry natron, crystalline and harsh, were piled high inside the body, and all around it, burying the deceased completely in a great mound of the stuff. The body would be left like this for 40 days. During this time, the natron worked its quiet, desiccating magic. It was a powerful drying agent, drawing every last drop of moisture from the skin, muscles and tissues, which is what bacteria need to cause decay. But it did more than that. The high alkaline pH of the natron also made it a powerful antiseptic, killing off any microbes the dryness didn't. In a bit of morbidly fascinating chemistry, the natron also reacted with the fats in the body in a process called saponification, turning them into a hard, waxy, soap-like substance that helped maintain the body's form. This wasn't the kind of relaxing 40-day spa treatment one might book today. It was a slow chemical transformation from perishable flesh into an eternal vessel for the soul. While natron was sending the souls of pharaohs to the afterlife, salt in its more common form was sustaining the lives of the common people. In a climate where food could spoil in a matter of hours, salt was a revolutionary technology. The Nile teemed with life, and salted fish was the protein that fueled the workers who built the pyramids. The scene at the salting yards along the riverbanks would have been a frantic, odorous, and vital part of the economy. Fishermen would haul in their nets, overflowing with tilapia and mullet. Workers would swarm the catch, gutting and splitting the fish with sharp flint knives, then rubbing them liberally with coarse salt before laying them out on reed mats to dry under the unforgiving Egyptian sun. The air would be thick with the smell of brine and fish, a smell that meant security, a pantry full for the lean months. It was a messy, smelly, indispensable job. Beyond preserving bodies and lunches, natron and salt permeated every corner of Egyptian life. Temple priests used dissolved natron as a liquid agent of purification, ritually cleansing sacred statues and offering chapels. It was a key ingredient in their medicine, used as an antiseptic for wounds and a component in various remedies. They even created an early form of toothpaste by mixing natron powder with other abrasives and aromatics, a concoction that would have certainly left your teeth feeling clean, though perhaps also feeling slightly sandblasted. The value of this mineral was immense. Egyptologists debate the exact nature of the control over the Wadi el Natron. Was it a direct state-run monopoly controlled by the pharaoh, or was its management delegated to powerful temple priesthoods who oversaw the supply? Whichever the case, controlling the source of natron meant controlling a fundamental pillar of both Egyptian religion and its economy. It was the substance that bridged the gap between the sacred and the profane, ensuring a pharaoh's eternal life, while also making sure a humble fisherman's catch would last the week. The story now follows the mineral's inexorable pull north, across the shimmering expanse of the Mediterranean Sea, to a peninsula that was, at this point, just a burgeoning power. The grand temples and palaces of Egypt are left behind for the dusty hills of Latium. Here, on the banks of the river Tiber, a small city-state is laying the foundations of what will become the most powerful empire the Western world has ever known. This is Rome, and like every great civilization before it, its rise was built not just on iron and will, but on salt. The Romans called it sal, and to them it was more than a mineral. It was the essence of health, the currency of conquest, and the bedrock of their civilization. It was their white gold. Rome's first source was close at hand. At the mouth of the Tiber, near the future port city of Ostia, were natural salt flats, using techniques of solar evaporation not so different from those we saw in China. The early Romans created saltans, vast, shallow ponds where they could harvest the gift of the sea. But as Rome's ambition grew, so did its appetite for salt. One source was not enough. A growing army and a swelling population needed a secure state-controlled supply, and so they created one of the oldest and most important roads in Italy, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. This wasn't originally a grand paved highway for chariots, but a dusty, well-trodden track, beaten into the earth by the hooves of countless cattle and the heavy tread of traders, its entire existence dedicated to transporting salt from the pans on the Adriatic coast inland to the capital. Imagine the journey: a slow-moving ox cart, its wooden wheels creaking a steady, rhythmic complaint. It's loaded high with rough burlap sacks filled with coarse, grayish salt crystals, a treasure more valuable than many of the spices it would later pass on the road. The journey is long and fraught with danger from bandits and rivals, all of whom understood the value of the cargo. The road itself became a lifeline, a vital artery pumping the lifeblood of preservation and flavor into the heart of the expanding republic. This road was so fundamental to Roman identity that its route is still a major modern road leading out of Rome today. The Roman army, the engine of its expansion, ran on salt. The Roman legionary was a marvel of endurance and discipline, but his body, like ours, was a delicate machine that required sodium to function. To keep hundreds of thousands of soldiers marching, fighting, and building across 3 continents, the state had to ensure a steady supply. This brings us to the famous concept of the salarium. We get our modern word salary directly from this Latin root. Now, the popular image is of soldiers being paid directly in cakes of salt, lining up to receive their gritty wages. "I'll trade you this month's pay for that slightly used shield," was probably not a common marketplace transaction. Historians still debate the exact nature of this payment. Were legionaries handed literal bags of salt on payday? It seems unlikely. More plausible is that the salarium argentum, or salt money, was a specific allowance, a portion of their coin wages officially designated for buying this vital commodity for themselves and their animals. The great Roman writer Pliny the Elder famously wrote that there is nothing more useful than salt and sun, and this sentiment was reflected in Roman culture, where a man who was not performing his duties well was said to be not worth his salt. Beyond the barracks and battlefields, salt was woven into the very fabric of Roman domestic life. At the Roman table, Even the most stoic philosopher would find their banquet a bit of a letdown without it. Small, elegant salt cellars, salonium, were a feature of every proper meal. But its most critical role was in the kitchen, as the chief agent of preservation. It was salt that allowed the Romans to transform fresh pork into savory prosciutto, an art they perfected. It was salt that preserved the olives picked from their sun-drenched groves. And it was salt that was the key ingredient in their most notorious and beloved condiment, garum. This was a pungent fermented fish sauce made by layering small fish like anchovies with salt in large clay urns and leaving them to macerate in the sun for months. The resulting liquid was strained and bottled, a complex savory umami-rich seasoning that was used in everything from stews to desserts. The smell from a garum factory must have been something truly special, but to the Romans it was the smell of good food. Salt was even a part of their rituals. A pinch of salt was placed on the lips of a newborn baby just 8 days after birth to ward off evil spirits, and offerings of salted flour were made to the household gods, the lares and penates, to ensure the family's well-being. From the soldier's ration to the sauce on the emperor's fish, this simple mineral was a constant essential presence in Roman life. As the structures of the Roman Empire slowly crumbled, its grand roads and state-controlled sultans fell into disrepair. The world didn't stop needing salt, of course. The biological imperative remained. The story of salt simply became more localized, more secretive, and in some places, far older than Rome itself. We journey now north of the Alps, into the misty, forested heart of pre-Roman Europe. Here, in the breathtaking landscape of what is now Austria, lies a placid lake, surrounded by mountains that claw at the sky. This is Hallstatt, a name that resonates deeply in European prehistory, and the source of its fame and wealth was not found in coastal plains, but deep within the mountains themselves. For thousands of years before the first Roman legionary complained about his salt rations, the people of Hallstatt were pulling a fortune out of the earth. Theirs was a different kind of salt, mined directly from a primordial mountain of rock salt, or leached from brine springs that seeped as if by magic from the mountainside. The Hallstatt culture, a powerful Iron Age civilization, didn't just stumble upon this resource. They built their entire society around it, becoming the undisputed salt barons of ancient Europe. The wealth they generated from this single location funded an aristocracy of incredible sophistication, whose lavish graves, filled with amber from the Baltic and ivory from Africa, speak of a trade network that crisscrossed the continent. Imagine descending into one of the ancient Hallstatt mines. This isn't an open-pit operation under the sun. It's a journey into the cold, silent darkness of the mountain's core. The tunnels are narrow, just wide enough for a single person, and reinforced with sturdy pine timbers that have held back the immense pressure of the earth for centuries. The only light comes from the flickering, greasy flame of a tallow lamp, casting long dancing shadows against the glistening salt-veined walls. The air is still and cold, and tastes distinctly of salt. The silence is broken only by the rhythmic tink, tink, tink of a bronze or iron pick chipping away at a seam of rock salt. Workers, covered in fine salt dust, would break off chunks of the crystalline rock, which were then packed into sturdy leather or wooden backpacks and hauled by hand back to the surface. It was slow, claustrophobic work, not a career for the faint of heart. But there was another, perhaps even more ingenious method at play. In some places, fresh water would seep into the mountain, dissolving the rock salt internally, and re-emerging from the mountainside as a supersaturated brine spring. The people of Hallstatt learned to harness this natural process. They built elaborate systems of wooden channels to direct the salty water down the steep slopes to the settlement below. And here, a different kind of industry flourished, one centered on the perpetual bubbling roar of brine cauldrons. The scene by the lake must have been shrouded in a permanent self-generated fog. Dozens of large, wide-mouthed ceramic vessels, the famous brine cauldrons, sat over constantly roaring fires. Workers, whose entire lives were attuned to the sounds and smells of their craft, would tend these fires day and night, Their job was one of patience and acute listening. They would pour the brine into the cauldrons and begin the long, slow process of boiling the water away. They would listen for the changing pitch of the bubbling, a signal that the concentration was reaching its peak. Too much heat, and the pot could crack. Not enough, and the process would take forever. As the water evaporated into a thick, briny steam that settled over the entire village, a thick sludge of salt crystals would be left at the bottom of the cauldron. This mush was scooped out, packed into conical molds, and dried near the fires into hard, transportable cakes of salt, the standard currency of Hallstatt trade. The joke might have been that everything in the village, from your clothes to your hair to your dinner, had a faint but permanent coating of salt from the ever-present steam. One of the most incredible things about the Hallstatt mines is their power of preservation. The salt-saturated, oxygen-poor environment is one of the world's best natural preservatives, creating a time capsule of life thousands of years ago. Archaeologists have pulled stunning artifacts from the darkness, things that would have rotted away anywhere else. They found a perfectly preserved wooden staircase from the Bronze Age, coiled ropes, and even scraps of patterned woolen fabric, still holding hints of their original color. Perhaps most famously, they have unearthed leather-carrying sacks, and even a 2500-year-old leather shoe, complete with its shoelace. One can easily picture the miner, thousands of years ago, whose shoe got stuck in the mud of the tunnel floor, groaning in frustration before deciding to abandon it in the dark. Historians and archaeologists wonder about the exact social structure that this industry supported. Were the miners part of a tribal cooperative, or were they a permanent laboring class, toiling for the benefit of a wealthy sword-wielding chieftain, whose funeral would be marked by immense golden jewelry? The richness of the graves suggests a powerful elite, one that understood, long before Rome, that whoever controls the salt, controls the world around them. From the dark, subterranean world of the Austrian mountains, our story drifts back out into the light, following the rivers of Europe to the windswept Atlantic coast. We land on the shores of Brittany, in northwestern France, in a place where the land and the sea merge into a mosaic of earth, water, and sky. This is the Guernsey Peninsula, a landscape that for 2,000 years has been sculpted by human hands for one single purpose: to coax salt from the seawater, not with fire, but with sun, wind, and infinite patience. This is the home of one of the world's most celebrated sea salts, the Sel de Guernsey, and the traditional home of its legendary harvesters, the Pelagiers. Imagine a landscape that looks like no other. It's a vast, sprawling wetland, a 2,000-hectare labyrinth of meticulously crafted clay ponds, channels, and dikes. It is not natural, it is entirely man-made, a stunning piece of hydraulic engineering passed down from the Iron Age, refined by the Romans, and perfected by medieval monks. At high tide, a series of gates are opened, and seawater from the Atlantic Ocean is allowed to flow into a large holding reservoir called the Vasier. This is the first step in a long meandering journey that can take weeks. From this reservoir, the Pelagiers, masters of their craft, use gravity and their intimate knowledge of the terrain to guide the water through a succession of ever shallower basins. The work is quiet and methodical, governed not by a clock, but by the cycles of the sun and moon, the tides, and the whims of the weather. The Pelagiers are dressed for their work in simple clothes, often barefoot to better feel the texture of the clay beneath their feet. They move through the maze of ponds with a grace born of deep familiarity, carrying their unique, long-handled wooden tools. They are part hydrologist, part farmer, part artist. They check the salinity of the water, its depth, its clarity, not with fancy instruments, but with skills passed down from their parents and grandparents. They are reading the landscape, listening to what the water is telling them. It's a profession that defies modernization. A bad decision, opening the wrong sluice at the wrong time, could flood the final evaporation pans with less salty water, ruining weeks of work. A joke among the locals might be that a true Pelagier can taste the salt percentage in the air. As the seawater snakes its way through this complex system, from the Vasier to smaller ponds called colbiers, fards, and finally, into the last shallowest crystallization pans known as embued. The sun and a gentle drying wind do their work. With each new basin, the brine becomes more concentrated. The final stage is a delicate one. In the embouts, which are just a few centimeters deep, the fully saturated brine finally surrenders to the sun, and here two types of salt are born. If the weather is warm, dry, and windy, a fragile feathery crust of pure white crystals will form on the very surface of the water, like a delicate sheet of ice. This is the flower of salt, the famous fleur de sel. This is the cream of the crop, the most precious harvest. The pelagiers must skim this off carefully, using a special rake, called a loose fleur, gently lifting the delicate crystals from the water's surface before they can sink to the bottom. Beneath the flower is the much larger harvest. As more water evaporates, the coarse grey salt, the cell graze, crystallizes on the clay bottom of the embued. This salt takes on some of the minerals and fine clay particles from the pan, giving it its characteristic grey color and a mineral complexity that chefs adore. At the end of the day, when conditions are right, the pelagiers use a different tool, a long wooden rake called a lasse, to pull this coarser salt to the edges of the pan, where it is piled into large mounds to drain. This is hard, physical labor under the open sky, a constant cycle of raking, pulling, and piling. The scholarly debate here often revolves around the continuity of this practice. How much of the technique seen today is a perfect, unbroken lineage from Roman times, and how much was refined or even reinvented by the savvy monks of Llandavenic Abbey in the 10th century, who systematized the trade. The written records give the monks much credit, but the folk tradition suggests the methods are far, far older. These salt workers were not just laborers, they were part of a unique and independent society. For centuries, the pelagiers of Guernsey were not serfs, but free people who owned their salt pans. Their trade was governed by its own ancient charters and rules. A young pelagier would learn the craft not in a school, but as an apprentice to a family member, absorbing the immense body of traditional knowledge: when to let the water in, how to read the clouds, the precise angle at which to draw the rake through the heavy, wet salt. Their life was one of quiet dignity and intense physical work, a stark contrast to the dramatic battles and court intrigues that dominate most history books. They were creating white gold, not with the fire and force of the Hallstatt miners, but with a gentle, patient collaboration with the sea and the sun. Leaving the sun-drenched, orderly pans of France, our narrative turns north, to the colder, wilder coasts of the North Sea. The winds are harsher here, the sun, a less reliable partner. We arrive in the world of the Norse, the people we famously call the Vikings. We often picture them as raiders, their longships slicing through the waves towards wealthy monasteries. But they were also settlers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen, living in an unforgiving environment, where survival through the long, dark winters depended entirely on planning and preservation. For the Vikings, who lived on the cusp of the sea, the ability to salt fish and meat was not a culinary choice. It was the absolute core of their food security. And without easy access to rock salt, or the constant sun needed for large-scale solar evaporation, they developed a different, more forceful method: brute force and fire. Imagine a small settlement on the jagged coast of Norway or Denmark around the 9th century. The centerpiece of the village, especially during the autumn, isn't a chieftain's hall, but a specialized salt boiling site, likely set back a bit from the main dwellings due to the constant smoke. This was known in Old Norse as a sidden site. The process was direct and profoundly laborious. First, at low tide, workers would head to the tidal flats, a broad muddy expanse of beach exposed by the receding water. They would scrape up the top layer of salty sand and silt, the earth that had been saturated with seawater and partially dried by the wind. They shoveled this heavy, damp material into carts or large baskets and hauled it back to the boiling site. The next step was filtration. They would build large, elevated platforms, perhaps with a base of woven reeds and peat. The salty sand was piled onto these filters. Then more seawater was poured over the top. As the water percolated through the sand, it dissolved the salt crystals trapped within, becoming an even more concentrated brine than the original seawater. This super salty liquid would drip slowly from the bottom of the filter into collection troughs or large clay pots dug into the ground. It was a messy, clever trick to shortcut the initial phase of evaporation, using the sand as a natural sponge to pre-concentrate the brine. Now came the fire. At the heart of the Seaden site was a long trench-like kiln or hearth, built from stone and clay. Along the top of this trench, a series of wide, shallow ceramic or lead pans were set. These pans were filled with the filtered brine, and a massive fire was built in the trench beneath them. This wasn't the gentle, ambient heat of the French sun. This was a roaring, wood-hungry inferno. The job of the salt boiler, or seeder, was a punishing one. For hours, even days on end, they would need to feed the fire, their faces perpetually hot and smoke-stung, while constantly watching the bubbling, steaming pans above. It was hot, thirsty, dangerous work. One splash of boiling brine could cause a severe burn. A moment of inattention could let the fire die down, ruining the rhythm, or flare up and crack the expensive pans. One could joke that Viking salt boilers probably had no eyebrows left by the end of a season. As the water boiled away with a furious hiss, a crust of salt crystals would form on the surface, and a thick slush would collect at the bottom. This salt was raked out and placed in molds or baskets to dry. The resulting product was coarse, grey, and probably tasted strongly of wood smoke, peat, and the sea. But to the Norse, it was treasure. This was the salt that would be rubbed into countless sides of cod to create klippfisk, fish dried on the seaside cliffs. It was what cured the pork that became their winter bacon, and the herring that would sustain them on long sea voyages. The importance of these coastal salt-making sites is often underestimated in popular tellings of the Viking Age. An army might march on its stomach, but a Viking longship sailed on a hold full of salted fish. Historians and archaeologists studying these sites have a key debate. Were these small independent family-run operations, or were they controlled by local chieftains who monopolized production? The sheer amount of fuel required, vast quantities of wood or peat, suggests a level of organization and resource control that points towards powerful local lords. They controlled the forests for the wood, the coast for the sand, and therefore they controlled the salt. One can easily picture a local jarl watching the plumes of steam rise from his Seaden works, knowing that each puff represented another layer of wealth and power, another resource that would allow him to build a new longship or attract more warriors to his banner. The salt boiled in these coastal fires wasn't just for a tasty meal. It was forging the very sinews of the Viking Age. From the smoke and fury of the Viking boiling pits, our journey takes a profound shift in temperament, crossing the vast Eurasian landmass to an archipelago in the east. We arrive in ancient Japan, a land of mountains, mist, and a deep cultural reverence for nuance and patience. Here, the pursuit of salt was elevated from a crude necessity into something approaching an art form. The method developed on these shores was not one of brute force, but of subtle collaboration with nature, a process that captured not just the salt of the sea, but its very soul. This is the story of Moshio-yaki, the patient and unique tradition of creating salt from seaweed. Let's stand on a beach along the Seto Inland Sea, a calm and sheltered body of water dotted with pine-clad islands. The scene is one of tranquility. Small fishing boats bob gently on the tide, and the air is soft with sea spray. This is the birthplace of Moshio, a type of salt whose origins are traced back to the Kofun period, the era of great burial mounds. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the people here looked at the sea not as something to be boiled into submission, but as a garden to be harvested. Their key insight was that certain types of seaweed, particularly the long, frond-like Hondawara or sargassum, were natural salt accumulators. After a storm, the beaches would be littered with this bounty from the sea. The process of Moshio-yaki, which translates roughly to seaweed salt roasting, was a testament to Japanese patience. The first step was harvesting. Workers would wade into the shallows or walk the shoreline after high tide, gathering armfuls of the dark green Hondawara. This seaweed was then carried to a clean, flat area of the beach and spread out carefully on reed mats to dry under the sun. It was a simple, quiet act, turning the seaweed over with wooden rakes to ensure it dried evenly, letting the sun and the breeze begin the work of concentration. Once the seaweed was dry and brittle, the true magic began. The workers would construct a simple but ingenious apparatus, often using bamboo to build a large raised frame. The dried seaweed was laid thickly upon this frame. Then, with great care, they would begin to pour fresh seawater over the top of the seaweed bed. The water would trickle slowly down through the tangled fronds. As it did so, it washed the salt crystals that had formed on the seaweed's surface, and it also absorbed the rich mineral salts and glutamates, the source of umami flavor from within the seaweed itself. The liquid that dripped from the bottom of the frame into collection vessels, usually large clay pots called doki, was no longer just seawater. It was now a concentrated brownish brine, imbued with the complex savory essence of the hondawara. This process was not done once. It was repeated over and over, pouring the collected brine back over the seaweed bed to make it ever more potent. Only when the brine had reached a desired concentration was it time for fire. And this was not the raging inferno of the Norse Sea. The seaweed-infused brine was poured into earthenware pots and set over a carefully tended, steady fire. The goal was to simmer, not to boil furiously. It was a slow evaporation, a gentle reduction. The person tending the pot had to watch it constantly, stirring to prevent the salt from burning on the bottom, their attention focused entirely on this gradual transformation. Compared to this painstaking multi-day process, the Viking method seems like a rather impatient and messy affair. You can almost imagine an ancient Japanese salt maker observing the Viking method and giving a polite, almost imperceptible shake of the head. As the last of the water steamed away, what was left in the bottom of the pot was not the coarse, grey, smoky grit of a Norse kiln, nor the pure white crystals of a Roman salt pan. Moshio was different. It was a moist, unrefined salt with a distinctive beige or light ochre color, and its taste was revolutionary. It was salty, of course, but it carried a deep, savory roundness, a mellow complexity that hinted at the ocean's depths. This was the birth of umami in seasoning. It was a salt you wouldn't just use to cure fish. It was a salt you would contemplate, a flavor to be savored. Archaeologists and food historians still debate the precise evolution of the technique. They piece the story together from fragments of ancient doki pottery found near coastlines, trying to determine if the final step always involved boiling, or if in some sunnier, drier regions of Japan, this enriched brine was then left to evaporate naturally in smaller clay pans. The finished moshio was more than just a preservative. It embodied a core principle of Japanese philosophy, finding harmony with nature rather than conquering it. This process took what the sea provided, the water and the seaweed, and combined them through patient human effort to create something more than the sum of its parts. It was used in sacred Shinto purification rituals, where salt's power to cleanse and preserve was given spiritual significance. It seasoned the simple rice and vegetable dishes of the common person, and graced the tables of the imperial court. The faint, savory hint of the sea captured in these beige crystals would become a foundational flavor of Japanese cuisine, a subtle echo of the quiet, patient work of the first moshio makers on the misty shores of the Sato Inland Sea. We now take an immense geographical leap, traveling from the humid shores of Japan to one of the most stark and dazzling landscapes on Earth. Our story arrives in the Indian subcontinent, specifically in the state of Gujarat, at the edge of the Thar Desert. Here lies a vast seasonal salt marsh, known as the Great Rann of Kutch. For most of the year, it is a desolate, cracked expanse of saline mudflats, stretching to the horizon under a blinding sun. But during the monsoon season, this desert is transformed, inundated by seawater from the Arabian Sea. And as the waters recede, and the scorching sun returns, they leave behind one of the largest salt plains in the world. This is the realm of the Agaria people, a community whose name literally means salt worker, and whose lives are a testament to some of the harshest salt harvesting conditions imaginable. For 8 months of the year, the Agarias move out into the barren, inhospitable desert. They leave their villages behind and set up temporary camps, living a semi-nomadic life, dictated solely by the salt harvest. Imagine a landscape of surreal, minimalist beauty. The ground is a brilliant, almost painful white, and the air shimmers with heat. There is no shade, no fresh water, and virtually no sign of life other than the agarias themselves. It's a place where the line between the sky and the earth seems to dissolve into a single blazing white glare. Surviving here, let alone performing intense physical labor, is an act of incredible human endurance. Their method of salt farming is a form of subsoil brine extraction. They believe that beneath the hard, crusty surface of the Ran lies a rich source of underground brine, far saltier than the surface water left by the monsoon. The process begins by digging a well, known as a pat. The men do this by hand, breaking through the tough upper crust to reach the slushy, saturated earth below. Once the well is dug, they install a diesel-powered pump to draw the subterranean brine up to the surface. It's a moment of noisy modern intrusion in an otherwise ancient-feeling landscape. This intensely salty water is then channeled into a series of large, shallow, rectangular salt pans, which they construct themselves from the desert mud, their edges forming crisp geometric lines against the white plain. This is where the entire family's labor comes into play. The pans are flooded with the brine, and then, much like in the solar evaporation pans of France, the sun is left to do its work. But the sun here is a much fiercer beast. Under its relentless glare, the water evaporates at a shocking rate. As it does, the agarias must constantly rake the bottom of the pan. This is often the job of the men, who spend hours wading barefoot through the highly corrosive brine. The salt leaches moisture from their skin and causes deep, painful cracks in their feet, wounds that often never fully heal. It is a grueling, repetitive motion, stomping and raking, to encourage the formation of uniform crystals and prevent the formation of a single hard crust. A common saying among them reflects their reality: we create the whitest salt in the world, but our own lives are filled with darkness. As the crystals form and thicken, they are harvested. The salt is scraped into immense piles at the edge of the pan, looking like pyramids of snow in the middle of the desert. The brilliant white of these mounds is a point of immense pride for the agarias, a sign of purity and quality. The women and older children then take over, breaking up the larger chunks, grading the salt, and packing it into sacks, ready for transport. This family-based cooperative labor is what makes the entire enterprise possible. For 8 months their whole world is this temporary camp next to their salt pans, their lives synchronized to the rhythm of pumping brine, raking crystals, and bagging the finished product. The history of salt making in the Ran is ancient, but the agaria story is one of marginalized people, whose grueling work fuels a massive industry. A key debate for social historians and economists is the effect of modern industry on these traditional communities. They produce a vast percentage of India's salt, yet for generations, they have been trapped in a cycle of poverty, often working as bonded laborers for larger companies and traders. They bear the brutal health consequences, skin diseases, tuberculosis, and severe eye damage from the constant glare, for a product that is sold for a pittance. The British colonial government, in a move to protect its own monopoly, famously made salt making by communities like the agarias illegal, a law that was famously defied by Mahatma Gandhi during his Dandi Salt March in 1930. While Gandhi's march was a protest against the salt tax levied by the British, it was also a powerful symbolic act that shone a light on the rights of indigenous people to harvest their own resources. Even today, the agarias fight for fair prices and legal recognition of their ancestral right to work this harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving land. Their story is a powerful reminder that behind a simple, essential commodity like salt, there can be a complex and often painful human struggle. From the dazzling, arid plains of India, our journey takes us across the Pacific to the humid, tropical lowlands of Central America. We travel back in time, to a world before European contact, to the vibrant and complex civilization of the Maya. In the lush greenery of what is now modern-day Belize, a sophisticated industry was thriving, driven not by gold or jade, but by the endless demand for salt. Here, along the mangrove-lined coasts and intricate networks of lagoons, the Maya built a sprawling enterprise to produce and trade salt on a remarkable scale. Their methods were so efficient that archaeologists refer to these locations as the salt cities. Imagine a place where the jungle meets the sea. The air is thick, heavy, with the scent of salt water, mangrove leaves, and wood smoke. Instead of grand stone pyramids rising from the jungle floor, the architecture here is functional, built for industry. You see a series of low thatched roof buildings and outdoor workshops, all connected by a web of raised wooden walkways and docks stretching out over the water. This isn't a sleepy fishing village, it's a bustling production center. Canoes, long and sleek, carved from the trunks of massive trees, are constantly arriving and departing, some laden with firewood from inland, others being carefully loaded with finished processed cakes of salt destined for the great inland cities like Tikal and Calakmul. The primary method used by the coastal Maya of Belize was the sal cocida, or boiled salt technique. Archaeologists working in the region, particularly on a submerged site called Paynes Creek Salt Works, which was preserved by being swallowed by the sea level rise, have pieced together the process with incredible detail. It was a clever, multi-stage operation. The first step was to capture the brine. Workers would go out into the salty lagoons and coastal flats and collect brine in large, wide-mouthed ceramic jars. But they didn't just boil this raw seawater. To make the process more efficient, they would leave these jars out in the sun, letting some of the water evaporate naturally to pre-concentrate the brine. The heart of the operation was the kitchen. Inside simple, open-sided structures with thatched roofs to keep the rain off, you would find rows of clay hearths. On top of these hearths, a remarkable piece of pre-industrial technology was at work. The Maya didn't just boil the brine in one big pot. Instead, they used hundreds of small, standardized, roughly cylindrical ceramic pots. They would fill these little pots with the concentrated brine, place them over the fire, and slowly bring the liquid to a simmer. A worker, likely a woman, as pottery was often women's work, would tend the fires, feeding them with mangrove wood while watching the pots carefully. A light-hearted jab might be that the smoke was a welcome relief, as it probably helped to keep the notoriously vicious tropical mosquitoes at bay. As the water boiled off, the salt crystals would form and sink. The worker would periodically add more brine to the pots until they were filled with a solid mass of salt. The crucial final step was to let the pots continue to heat over the embers of the fire. This would not only dry the salt completely, but also harden it into a solid, standardized cake, the exact size and shape of the pot it was cooked in. These cakes were ideal for transportation. They were durable, stackable, and easily quantifiable. A trader in a far-off city didn't need to weigh loose salt. He could trade for 10 or 20 or 100 cakes of salt, a standardized unit of currency and preservation. These small pots were in essence disposable packaging. To get the salt out, you simply broke the ceramic vessel, revealing the perfect block of salt within. The archaeological sites are littered with millions of these broken pottery shards, a testament to the sheer scale of the industry. The economic and political implications of this industry were enormous. Salt was a vital necessity for the inland Maya, whose diet was heavily based on maize, a grain low in sodium. The inland city-states needed salt for their populations, and the coastal salt cities controlled the supply. This created a powerful and lucrative trade relationship. Salt was likely exchanged for goods that were scarce on the coast: volcanic stone for grinding tools, durable hardwoods from the deep forest, and perhaps even the brightly colored feathers of quetzal birds for ceremonial attire. Scholars still actively debate the political structure of these salt-producing communities. Were they independent kingdoms that grew rich on their saline monopoly, or were they client states directly controlled and managed by one of the larger inland superpowers? The evidence suggests a complex network of alliances and dependencies, a coastal economy that was absolutely essential to the health and stability of the entire Maya civilization. These workshops were not just making seasoning, they were forging the economic bonds that held the Maya world together. The canoes of the Maya salt traders fade into the past, and we cross the Atlantic once more, arriving on the shores of medieval England. The landscape is damp and green, a world of drizzling rain, muddy fields, and looming stone castles. It's the England of the 11th century, a realm freshly conquered by the Normans and meticulously catalogued in one of the most remarkable documents of the Middle Ages, the Domesday Book. This extraordinary survey, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, was designed to be a comprehensive inventory of his new kingdom, detailing every manor, village, forest, and mill, so he could know exactly what he owned and how much he could tax it. And woven throughout its dense Latin scripted pages is a surprising testament to the quiet, unassuming, but absolutely vital economic engine of coastal England, the Sultan. Let's stand on a bleak, windswept stretch of the coast in Lincolnshire or Essex. The scene is not one of dramatic beauty. It's a low-lying, marshy estuary where a river sluggishly meets the North Sea. The air carries the damp, briny scent of mudflats and salt spray. For centuries, this seemingly unproductive landscape has been the site of a sprawling industry. The Domesday Book records over 1,000 salini, or salt works, dotted along the English coastline. These were not vast glittering pans like in Guerande, nor were they industrial boiling houses. The English medieval method was a hybrid, a muddy, laborious process, perfectly adapted to its cloudy and unpredictable climate. The process, often referred to as salt-to-salt production, was an ingenious adaptation to a world with unreliable sunlight. It began at the highest spring tides, when the seawater pushed furthest inland, saturating the coastal mudflats. When the tide receded, it left behind a thin crust of salt on the surface of the mud. This salty sludge, known as malm, was the raw ingredient. Workers, known as salters, would scrape this top layer of mud into large heaps. Think back to the Norse method. This is a very similar first step, using the earth itself as a preliminary sponge to capture the brine. The job was muddy, cold, and relentlessly damp. A medieval salter probably spent their entire working life with permanently wet feet. Next came the washing. The collected salty mud was placed into prepared filtration pits, which were lined with clay and often packed with peat or turf. The salters would then pour seawater over this mud. As the water trickled through, it would wash the concentrated salt from the sludge, creating a rich, potent brine. This was the key trick, using seawater to wash mud that was already saltier than the seawater, resulting in a brine that was far more concentrated than what you could get just by dipping a bucket in the ocean. This significantly reduced the amount of fuel needed for the next most crucial stage. This quirky, muddy system was a clever response to England's lack of consistent, powerful sunshine. Why wait for the sun to evaporate the water when you can get the mud to do half the work for you? Finally, the brine was taken to the boiling houses. These were small, drafty huts, filled with the smoke and steam of the perpetually tended fires. The brine was boiled in wide, shallow lid pans, a technology likely inherited from the Roman occupation centuries earlier. Lead was an ideal material for the job. It was relatively cheap, easy to repair, and it conducted heat well. The salter's job was to keep the fire stoked and the brine simmering, a skilled task requiring constant attention. The scholarly debate surrounding these lead pans centers on their health effects. Historians and scientists speculate about the levels of lead poisoning that must have been prevalent among these workers, and the people who consumed the salt, which would have inevitably contained traces of the metal. It's a sobering thought that the very mineral meant to preserve life may have also been slowly poisoning its makers. As the water boiled away, the salt crystals were raked out, dried, and prepared for trade. The Domesday Survey is so meticulous that it not only lists the existence of these sultans, but often records their specific economic value, or the rent paid to the local lord, sometimes in cash, sometimes in measures of salt. This reveals just how integral salt production was to the manorial economy. A single sultan could be more valuable to a lord than acres of farmland. It was this salt that cured the herring that fed the peasants through the winter, that preserved the bacon in the castle larder, and that was used in the buttery to churn butter that wouldn't spoil. The quiet, smoky, muddy work happening on these unremarkable coastlines was a cornerstone of England's medieval wealth, a fact captured with bureaucratic precision in the pages of a conqueror's grand inventory. The salter, caked in mud and breathing in smoke and steam, was an unsung hero of the medieval English economy. Our story now returns to the Mediterranean, but to a different power, one born not from land-based conquest, but from the sea itself. We drift into the shimmering lagoons of a city that should not exist, a jewel box of palaces and churches built on a foundation of mud islands and wooden piles. This is Venice, La Serenissima. For centuries, Venice was not just a city on the water, it was an empire of the sea, and its entire edifice of power, its magnificent fleets, and its staggering wealth were built upon one crucial commodity: salt. The Venetians didn't just trade in salt, they weaponized it, using their control over its production and distribution to dominate the politics and commerce of the entire Adriatic and beyond. The foundations of Venice's salty empire were laid in the vast shallow lagoons that surrounded the nascent city. As early as the 6th century, the inhabitants of these marshy islands were harvesting salt, using solar evaporation, a craft they perfected in the ideal conditions of their protected waters. The Venetian lagoon acted as a gigantic, natural sultan. They refined the Roman and Byzantine techniques, becoming masters of building and managing complex networks of evaporation ponds. These were their first gold mines, or rather their white gold mines. The early Venetian doges, the city's elected leaders, were canny and understood the power they held. Salt was essential for preserving fish, the primary protein of the region, and for curing meats for trade and for outfitting their growing navy. As Venice grew more powerful and ambitious, its leaders realized that simply producing their own salt wasn't enough. True power lay in controlling the salt of others. They began to use a combination of shrewd diplomacy, economic pressure, and when necessary, outright military force to establish a complete monopoly over the salt trade in the Adriatic Sea. This policy, known as the Monopolio del Sale, was ruthlessly enforced. Venice systematically bought up or conquered key sultans along the Dalmatian coast, in places like Chioggia, Servia, and the islands of Pag and Rab. Once they controlled these production centers, they forbade the local populations from producing any more salt than was needed for their own immediate consumption. All surplus salt had to be sold to Venice, at a price set by Venice. The Venetian state became the ultimate middleman. Their galleys, the famous merchant ships that plied the Mediterranean, would collect the salt from these controlled territories and transport it back to Venice's central salt warehouse, the gigantic Saloni, at the western tip of the city's main island group. This was a state-run enterprise on an epic scale. Here the salt was stored, processed, and then resold at a significant markup to the cities of the Italian mainland, to the growing states of Germany and Austria, and throughout the Byzantine Empire. For cities like Bologna or Milan, which had no salt resources of their own, defying Venice was not an option. You either bought your salt from Venice, or your people went without. This gave the Venetian Republic immense leverage in all its political dealings. You can almost hear a Venetian diplomat calmly ending a tense negotiation with the line, "A beautiful city you have here. It would be a shame if your winter stores were to spoil." The management of this empire of salt was meticulous. The Venetian government created a special magistracy, the Magistrato al Sal, a board of officials whose entire job was to oversee every aspect of the salt trade, from production quotas and quality control, to pricing and taxation. They set the rules, and the penalties for breaking them were severe. Smuggling salt, for a Venetian, was a crime on par with treason. Historians often debate the true genius of the Venetian system. Was it their maritime skill, their banking innovations, or was it this foundational, brutally efficient control of a simple, essential mineral? The answer is likely that all these things were interconnected, built upon the initial bedrock of their salt monopoly. The profits from the salt trade funded the construction of the mighty Venetian arsenal, the shipyard that could churn out a fully equipped war galley in a single day. It paid the salaries of their diplomats and filled the coffers of their merchant families. So as you picture the splendor of Venice, the Doge's palace, the glittering mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica, a gondola gliding silently down a quiet canal, remember that this fairy tale city was built on something far more prosaic. It was built on the back-breaking labor of countless forgotten salt workers toiling under the sun on distant Adriatic coasts, on the shrewd, calculating policies of its leaders, and on the state's iron-fisted control over the tiny white crystals that everyone needed, but only Venice could reliably supply. The beauty of Venice is undeniable, but its foundations are pure, hard, economic power, crystallized from the sea. Leaving the intricate politics of the Venetian lagoon, we sail out through the Pillars of Hercules and into the vast rolling expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Our journey takes us to the southwestern tip of Europe, to a region famed for its rugged coastline, sun-drenched beaches, and a history deeply entwined with the sea. This is the Algarve region of southern Portugal. For centuries, long before it became a popular tourist destination, this coast was a landscape of labor, producing a brilliant white sea salt, sal marino, harvested using methods as old as the Romans, but perfected with a distinctively Portuguese character. Imagine the coastline near towns like Castro Marine or Tavira. The landscape is a mosaic of tidal marshes, estuaries, and shimmering salt pans, or salinas, that stretch inland from the sea. The sun here feels different from the misty light of England, or the humid haze of the Mayan coast. It is a powerful, reliable presence, a relentless engine of evaporation that beats down on the pans from a clear blue sky for more than 300 days a year. This predictable, intense sunlight, combined with the low rainfall and the clean Atlantic waters, created the perfect conditions for producing high-quality solar sea salt. The methods used here feel like a cousin to those we saw in Grande, but with their own local rhythms and tools. The process begins with the tide. A master salter, the Marnoto, opens a series of sluice gates at the high tide of the full or new moon, allowing the Atlantic to flood into a network of large reservoirs. These are the viveros, the nurseries where the seawater begins its slow and patient journey. From here, the Marnoto, a figure of immense traditional knowledge, orchestrates the flow of the water. He guides it from the viveros into a complex series of shallower concentrating ponds. Each pond is a step up in the chain of salinity. The water moves slowly, inch by inch, day by day, leaving a little of its freshness behind in each basin as the sun does its work. The Marnoto's skill is everything. He must know the feel of the water, judging its saltiness by instinct and experience, deciding with the precision of a scientist when to move it to the next stage. Finally, the supersaturated brine reaches the crystallization pans. These are small, shallow, impeccably flat basins with clay-lined bottoms, arranged in neat geometric grids. And here, under the heat of the Algarve sun, the transformation happens. As in Grande, two types of salt are born. First comes the delicate, flaky flor de sal, the flour of salt, which is skimmed gently from the surface by the workers. This was the premium product, prized for its subtle flavor and fine texture. But the bulk of the harvest is the sal marino, the sea salt that crystallizes on the bottom of the pans. Now, the main tool of the Portuguese Marnoto comes into play. It is a long-handled wooden rake called a rodo, but unlike the pulling rakes of France, the Portuguese technique involves pushing. The workers carefully push the newly formed salt crystals through the brine, creating clean white mounds at the edges of the pans. It's a craft of gentle persuasion, not brute force. The salt is then shoveled onto large conical drying piles next to the pans, where the last of the moisture will drain away under the hot sun, leaving behind a sparkling pure white treasure. You can imagine the friendly professional rivalry between a French paludier and a Portuguese Marnoto, each arguing that their specific raking technique, pulling versus pushing, is the superior art form. A light-hearted debate passed down through generations of salt makers. For centuries, this salt was the foundation of Portugal's age of discovery. The great fleets of caravels and carracks that set out under Prince Henry the Navigator to explore the coast of Africa and beyond required immense stores of preserved food. It was this Algarve salt that cured the fish and meat that sustained Vasco da Gama's crew on their voyage to India. A key point that historians emphasize is the link between this local industry and Portugal's global ambitions. Without a secure, high-quality domestic supply of salt, the legendary Portuguese voyages of exploration would have been logistically impossible. The road to the spice routes of the East was paved, in a sense, with salt from the sunny pans of the Algarve. The site of the salt harvest is one of timeless, peaceful industry. The Marnotos, often working in loose white clothes to reflect the sun, move with a slow, practiced rhythm through the shimmering landscape. The silence is punctuated only by the scrape of the rhodo on the bottom of the pan and the calls of seabirds. But like many traditional practices, the Algarve salinas have faced decline in the modern era, replaced by cheaper, industrially mined salt. Today, there's a renewed appreciation for this ancient craft. Many of the historic salinas are being restored, and the artisanal flor de sal and sal marino of the Algarve are once again celebrated by chefs around the world. It's a quiet testament to the enduring value of a craft that works in harmony with the sun and the sea. Throughout our long and winding journey, from the misty shores of Viking Norway to the humid workshops of the Maya, one figure has remained a constant, though their title and tools may have changed. This is the salt boiler, the lonely artisan who stood before the fire, transforming liquid brine into solid, life-sustaining crystals. While the sun-drenched pans of Portugal and France offer a romantic image of peaceful collaboration with nature, the reality for a huge portion of the world's salt history was one of heat, smoke, and steam. Mastering the art of the boiler was a crucial, often underappreciated skill, and it is to this specific craft that we now turn. Let's step into a typical boiling house, or saltern, from 17th century Cheshire, England. The salt industry here, centered around towns like Northwich and Middlewich, wasn't coastal. It was based on natural underground brine springs, discovered by the Romans centuries earlier. The building itself is simple, almost crude, a timber-framed shed with a high-peaked roof to let the steam escape, and walls that are perpetually damp and blackened with soot. The air inside is thick and almost unbreathable, a cocktail of coal smoke, water vapor, and the acrid tang of brine. It's a claustrophobic, sensory-assaulting environment, a far cry from the open sky of the Algarve. In the center of this murky hall sits the heart of the operation, a row of large rectangular iron pans, each holding hundreds of gallons of bubbling, simmering brine. The man in charge of this alchemical transformation is the salt boiler, or as he was known here, the waller. His job is a 24-hour-a-day responsibility, often performed in brutally long 12-hour shifts. His first task is to manage the fire. Beneath the iron pans lies a series of furnaces, which he must constantly feed with coal. This is not a gentle crackling hearth. It is a roaring, ravenous beast. The waller must control the temperature with a craftsman's precision, using dampers and his judgment to keep the heat high enough to evaporate the water efficiently, but not so high that it damages the expensive iron pans or burns the salt. He is part smith, part chemist, his body attuned to the subtle changes in the fire's roar and the color of its flames. His attention then turns to the pan itself. As the brine heats and bubbles, impurities and scum rise to the surface. One of his key jobs is to skim this off with a large, long-handled tool called a skimmer. The popular historical anecdote, which might be more fiction than fact, is that some salters would add blood or egg whites to the brine. The proteins would coagulate in the heat, trapping the floating impurities and making them easier to skim off. A bit of a gruesome kitchen trick, but a potentially effective one for clarifying his product. As the brine becomes more and more concentrated, he has to draw the pan. Using a different tool, a long-handled rake or drawer, he scrapes the newly formed salt crystals from the bottom of the pan towards the sides. The size and texture of the final salt crystal were entirely dependent on the waller's skill, specifically his control over the temperature. If he kept the brine at a fierce rolling boil, the rapid evaporation would produce very fine-grained salt. If he lowered the temperature and let the brine simmer gently for a longer period, larger, coarser crystals would form. Different grades of salt were needed for different purposes. Fine salt for the table, coarse salt for packing fish, and a skilled waller knew exactly how to produce each type on demand. Historians still study the specific regional techniques and trade secrets of these salters. Was a Cheshire waller's technique fundamentally different from that of a German cedar or an American salt boiler in the Ohio Valley? The basic principles were the same, but the local nuances and inherited tricks of the trade were a source of immense professional pride. Once the salt was drawn from the pan, it was heavy and saturated with brine. It was shoveled into conical wicker baskets called barrows and moved to a drying room. Here, The baskets were set on racks above flues that channeled heat from the furnaces, allowing the salt to dry completely and whiten. The final product was a hard, conical loaf of salt, which could be easily stacked, stored, and transported. The life of a waller was notoriously hard and often short. The constant exposure to intense heat and coal dust led to chronic lung diseases, and the labor was physically punishing. They were a tough, insular community, their skills passed from father to son, their lives spent in the twilight world of the boiling house. They were the anonymous, soot-stained engine of a global economy, their lonely craft turning a simple saline solution into the white gold that preserved food, financed states, and made the modern world possible. Our journey through the ages and across the continents has shown us that the story of salt is the story of civilization. We have stood with our earliest ancestors at a salt lick on the savannah, raked crystals from the imperial lakes of China, and felt the volcanic heat of a Viking boiling pit. We have seen salt build empires, fund voyages of discovery, and sustain life in the harshest of environments. And now, as our story draws to a close, we find ourselves in the present, returning to one of the quiet, traditional salt pans, perhaps in France or Portugal, or even on the misty coast of Japan. The light is fading. The sun, which has been the tireless engine of this work all day, is now sinking towards the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. The day's labor is done. The last of the fleur de sel has been skimmed from the water's surface. The last mounds of coarse cell gris have been raked into neat piles to drain overnight. The tools, the long-handled wooden rakes and skimmers that have hardly changed in their design for 1,000 years, are leaning against the wall of a small tool shed, waiting for tomorrow. The air, which during the day was filled with the sounds of work, the scrape of wood on clay, the splash of brine, the quiet conversation of the workers, is now falling silent. All that remains is the gentle whisper of the evening breeze rippling across the surface of the salt pans, creating shimmering patterns that reflect the last of the day's light. The great birds of the marsh are settling into the reeds for the night, their final calls echoing softly over the water. It is a scene of profound and deep peace, a peace that has been earned by a long day of patient, rhythmic labor. You can feel the immensity of the history held within this simple landscape. Each shallow pond, each earthen dike, each carefully maintained channel is a testament to the accumulated knowledge of countless generations. The ghosts of the past feel very close in a place like this. Roman legionaries, medieval monks, hard-faced merchants, and the long, unbroken lines of families who have dedicated their lives to this craft, all have left their invisible mark. They all understood the quiet magic of this place, where the sea is coaxed into giving up its treasure, not by force, but by a gentle and respectful partnership. This kind of work represents a connection to the world that feels increasingly rare in our modern age. It is a slow, analog process in a fast, digital world. It is a craft that requires a deep understanding of the subtle signs of nature, the strength of the wind, the angle of the sun, the phases of the moon. As the final sliver of the sun disappears, the landscape transforms once more. The water in the pans now mirrors the deep indigo of the twilight sky, dotted with the first faint stars. The white mounds of harvested salt seem to glow with a soft internal luminescence, standing like silent sentinels in the deepening dusk. This is the moment of rest, the pause between the work of today and the work of tomorrow. Soon, industrial machinery will arrive to load the great mounds into trucks, taking this ancient hand-harvested product into the complex global supply chain. But for now, in the quiet of this evening, the place exists outside of time. It is a landscape that would be recognizable to a salt maker from 500 or even 1,000 years ago. The enduring, elemental power of the process, sun, wind, and sea, remains unchanged. It's a reminder that beneath all the complexities of human history, our survival has always been tied to these fundamental natural forces and to our own ingenuity in learning how to work with them. And so, we leave this peaceful scene, this salty garden sleeping under the stars. The great sprawling history of this humble mineral, a history of industry, of empire, of survival and flavor, finally comes to rest in the quiet of the salt pans at dusk. The cycle will begin again with the rising of tomorrow's sun and the turning of the tide, just as it has for millennia. It is a slow and steady rhythm, a deeply reassuring one, a story written in water and earth, a narrative of patience rewarded, of labor turned into life itself. The air grows cooler now, and a gentle stillness settles over the pans. The world holds its breath, waiting for the dawn, and the salt quietly waits to be gathered, its long journey almost complete. As you drift deeper now, let the gentle rhythm of the tides and the patient work of the sun be the last images in your mind. The slow, ancient, and deeply calming story of salt is a reminder that even the most essential things in our lives come from a place of quiet, methodical effort, a process as peaceful and steady as your own gentle breathing as you begin to drift off to sleep. Rest now, in the stillness of the salty sunset, and let your dreams be as deep and as peaceful as the ancient sea itself. And as the last of that imagery fades, you can allow yourself to fully let go. There is nothing more to learn tonight, nothing more to analyze. The story is told, the work is done, and now there is only this comfortable darkness, this gentle quiet. You can feel the weight of your own body being supported, the gentle rise and fall of your chest with each easy breath. Let the quiet murmurings of history recede into the background, becoming a soft, indistinct hum that signals it is time for true and deep rest. The salt of the earth, the salt of the sea, has given way to the gentle peace of the night. Every muscle in your body can relax now. Every thought can soften and drift away like a cloud on a gentle breeze. There is only here and now, and the profound stillness of a world asleep. The final harvest is your own peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams.